All right, so today we're going to dig into something that I think everyone who's ever worked on a project can relate to.
Oh, yeah.
What happens when things go wrong?
Right when those curveballs come at you.
Exactly, because let's face it, no matter how well we plan, something unexpected always seems to pop up.
Absolutely. It's
Mhm.
kind of the nature of projects, isn't it?
It really is.
Hmm.
So today we're going to specifically focus on getting a handle on project issues.
Yeah.
Those problems that just seem to throw a wrench into everything.
Right, those moments where you really have to think on your feet.
Exactly. And we want this to be really practical, not just a bunch of theory, but actionable stuff that you can actually use.
Exactly. We're all about giving you the tools to tackle those tricky situations.
Right. So that you can stay calm, cool, and collected and keep your project moving forward. And by the way, this is all part of the practical project management training brought to you by Virgin Palms at www.virginpalms.org.
So let's jump right in, shall we? What exactly are we talking about when we say project issue?
Well, think of it this way. A project issue is basically a problem that's already happened, right? It's not something that might happen in the future. It's a real live obstacle that's actively impacting your project.
And that's a key distinction, isn't it? It's different from a risk.
Yes, exactly. A risk is something that could potentially cause a problem down the line, but an issue is a problem that's right here, right now, and it's already causing trouble.
So it's the difference between anticipating a potential problem and actually dealing with a real one.
Precisely. So let's say you have a key team member who suddenly resigns. That's an issue. It's a reality you're now facing.
Whereas if you were worried that someone might resign, that would have been a risk, something to keep an eye on and maybe come up with a plan B for.
Exactly. And this is where the whole idea of preventive versus corrective actions comes into play with risks. You're trying to prevent them from ever happening or at least minimize their impact. But with issues, you're in damage control mode. You're taking corrective action to fix the problem that's already occurred. And here's a good example. Let's say you're working on a project and you're relying on a supplier to deliver some critical materials. If you're worried that the supplier might delay the shipment due to bad weather, for instance, that's a risk.
Right.
You might try to mitigate that risk by identifying a backup supplier just in case.
A solid plan B.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But if the supplier actually does delay the shipment, and now your project timeline is in jeopardy,
Yeah.
that's an issue you have to deal with head on.
Okay, so we've got a good grasp on what an issue is now. Why is it so important to manage these things effectively? I mean, it seems kind of obvious, but maybe we can spell out the benefits.
Sure. Well, first of all, think about the impact on your project schedule. When you address issues promptly and efficiently, you prevent those little hiccups from turning into major roadblocks.
Right, it's like stopping a small leak before it becomes a flood.
Exactly. And the same goes for your budget. If you let issues fester,
Yeah.
they can lead to all sorts of unexpected expenses.
Yeah.
Things like having to work overtime or bring in extra resources to get things back on track.
And that can really eat into your profit margin.
It absolutely can. And then there's the impact on your stakeholders, your clients, your sponsors, your team members, everyone involved. When they see that you're actively managing and resolving issues, it builds a huge amount of confidence in your ability to deliver.
It shows you're on top of things and that you can handle the pressure.
Exactly. And that trust is so important, especially when things get tough. Effective issue management also improves your team's overall efficiency. When problems are addressed quickly, it helps everyone stay focused and productive.
Hmm.
They're not constantly getting bogged down by firefighting and putting out fires.
Right, it keeps the momentum going.
And here's another big one. Every time you successfully resolve an issue, you gain valuable insights and experience that you can apply to future projects. It's a learning opportunity.
Like they say, experience is the best teacher. Sometimes the toughest lessons are the most valuable ones.
That's so true. So clearly, there are a lot of benefits to effectively managing issues. But
Mm.
on the flip side, what happens when you don't handle them properly?
Well, that's when things can really start to spiral out of control. You might start to see that dreaded scope creep, where the project requirements keep expanding and expanding.
It's like a never-ending to-do list.
Exactly. And those seemingly small additions can really add up. They impact your timeline, they impact your budget, and they can seriously compromise the quality of your final deliverables.
And of course, all of this can lead to missed deadlines and budget overruns, which nobody wants.
And ultimately, it can damage your reputation and your relationships with stakeholders.
Exactly. So it's really a domino effect, isn't it? One small unresolved issue can trigger a whole chain of problems, and before you know it, the whole project is in jeopardy.
So the key takeaway here is that understanding the difference between risks and issues and knowing how to effectively manage those issues is absolutely crucial for project success.
Couldn't agree more. And before we move on, here's a question for you, our listener, to ponder, think back to a past project, can you recall a time when a risk that you had anticipated actually materialized into an issue? How did you handle it at the time? And looking back, what was the overall impact on the project?
I think that's a really valuable exercise. Reflecting on past experiences can help us learn and grow as project professionals.
Definitely. All right, so now that we've laid that groundwork, let's shift gears a bit and talk about how we can actually spot those early warning signs that a risk is starting to turn into a real problem.
Right, because the sooner we can detect those signals, the better equipped we'll be to take action and prevent things from escalating.
Exactly. So what are some of those red flags that we should be looking out for in our projects?
Well, one of the most obvious signs is consistently missed milestones. If you're repeatedly failing to meet those key deadlines, it's a pretty clear indication that something isn't quite right.
Makes sense. What else should we be paying attention to?
Another big one is budget overruns. If you're starting to see your costs exceeding your initial projections, it's definitely a cause for concern.
Okay. What else?
Well, keep a close eye on stakeholder sentiment. Are you getting any negative feedback from your clients, your sponsors, or even your own team members? That could be a sign that expectations aren't being met or that there are underlying issues brewing.
Right. Sometimes those subtle cues can be really telling.
Absolutely. Also, pay attention to increased dependencies. If your project becomes overly reliant on external factors or specific individuals, it increases the risk of things going wrong if those dependencies don't pan out.
So basically, the more moving parts you have, the greater the chance that something could go astray.
Exactly. And finally, be wary of an excessive number of change requests. While some changes are inevitable, too many can signal a problem with how the project scope was initially defined.
It's like trying to hit a moving target.
Precisely so. Those are some of the more obvious warning signs. But in your experience, is there anything else, maybe a more subtle indicator that people often miss that can actually signal a bigger problem brewing under the surface?
Yeah. You know what I've noticed sometimes is when there's a sudden and persistent increase in the number of questions or requests for clarification from the team, beyond what's typical.
Interesting. Can you elaborate on that a bit?
Sure. It's like a shift in the energy.
Yeah.
You start getting bombarded with these questions about things that seem pretty straightforward before it could be a sign that maybe some assumptions were made early on that aren't actually holding true, or that the approach you're taking isn't as clear or as feasible as everyone initially thought.
That's a really good point. It's like a little tremor before the earthquake.
Exactly. So now let's talk about the two main approaches to managing issues, proactive and reactive.
Right, because while we always want to prevent problems from happening in the first place, sometimes we have to be prepared to react when they do.
Exactly. So let's start with proactive issue management. How can we get ahead of the curve and prevent those risks from actually becoming full-blown issues?
Well, it all starts with regular risk assessments, taking the time to identify potential problems early on, and then having plans in place to mitigate or avoid those risks if possible.
So it's like having a safety net.
Exactly. And along with that, you want to develop contingency plans. What will you do if a particular risk actually does occur? Having those backup plans ready to go can save you a lot of time and stress down the line.
Right. It's like having a plan B and maybe even a plan C.
Precisely. And just as important is maintaining open communication with your team and your stakeholders. If people feel comfortable speaking up about potential problems early on, you're much more likely to catch those issues before they escalate.
It's all about creating that environment of trust and transparency.
Absolutely. And finally, you want to keep a close eye on your key performance indicators. Those are those measurable values that tell you how well your project is progressing. If you see any significant deviations from your plan, it could be an early warning sign that a risk is starting to materialize.
Okay, so that's proactive issue management. But what about when we're already in the thick of it and an issue has actually occurred? How do we manage that reactively?
Well, the first step is to document the issue properly. Make sure it's clearly logged in your issue log with all the relevant details.
So we're talking about things like what the issue is, when it was identified, who's responsible for addressing it, that kind of stuff.
Exactly. And then you want to prioritize the issue based on its potential impact.
Hmm.
Is this something that could derail the entire project, or is it a more minor problem that can be addressed later on?
Right. You want to focus your energy and resources on the most critical issues first.
Absolutely. Then, of course, comes the actual problem-solving phase, working with your team and your stakeholders to develop and implement a solution.
And once you've addressed the issue, it's really important to conduct a post-resolution review.
Right. You want to understand what happened, why it happened, and what you can learn from the experience to prevent similar issues from occurring in the future.
It's all about continuous improvement.
Exactly. So the key takeaway here is that being aware of the early warning signs and having both proactive and reactive strategies in place for managing issues can make a world of difference in your project's success.
Absolutely. And here's another question for you to reflect on. What mechanisms do you currently have in place to monitor potential risks on your projects? Are they effective in giving you those early warnings, or do you find yourself constantly reacting to problems after they've already blown up?
Really take some time to think about that because early detection can be a game changer.
All right, let's move on now to what happens once we've spotted a potential problem. How do we actually go about clearly identifying and documenting it so that we can start taking action?
That's a great question because, sometimes it can be tricky to know when something has officially crossed the line from a risk to an actual issue.
Right. When is it time to sound the alarm, so to speak?
Exactly. So, in addition to those early warning signs we discussed, there are a few more concrete indicators that something has become an issue that needs to be addressed.
Like what?
Well, if you're consistently missing deadlines, that's a pretty big red flag. It's one thing to have a slight delay here and there, but if you're constantly behind schedule, it's usually a sign that there are some deeper issues at play.
Right, it's a pattern.
Exactly. And the same goes for budget overruns. If you're consistently exceeding your budget, it's another clear indication that something is amiss.
Okay. What else should we be looking for?
Well, a noticeable dip in team morale can be a sign that there are underlying issues causing stress and frustration.
Hmm.
If people are feeling overwhelmed or discouraged, it's worth investigating what's going on.
Right. Happy teams tend to be productive teams.
Exactly. And pay close attention to any complaints or negative feedback you're getting from your stakeholders. They're often the first ones to notice when things aren't going as planned.
So don't just dismiss those complaints as people being difficult.
No, absolutely not. They might be pointing out a genuine problem that needs to be addressed. And finally, if you start seeing repeated errors or defects in your deliverables, that's a pretty strong signal that something's not right in your process.
So basically, it's about being vigilant and really paying attention to all those signals, both the big ones and the small ones.
Exactly. Now, in addition to being reactive and responding to these clear signs of trouble, are there any proactive steps we can take to try and uncover potential issues before they even surface?
Yeah, that's a great question because ideally we want to be ahead of the game as much as possible.
Right. So one really effective approach is to hold regular project status meetings. Create a dedicated forum where team members can openly share any concerns they have or any potential problems they're seeing on the horizon.
So it's like a preventative checkup for your project.
Exactly. And you can also leverage performance tracking tools and dashboards to monitor your progress against the plan. If you see any deviations, you can investigate them right away and take corrective action before they turn into major issues.
Right. It's all about staying on top of things.
Absolutely. And fostering a culture of open communication within your team is so important. If people feel comfortable speaking up and sharing their concerns, you're much more likely to catch those issues early on.
It's about creating a safe space where people can raise their hand and say, hey, I think we might have a problem here.
Precisely. And finally, don't underestimate the power of consistently monitoring those key performance indicators, those KPIs we talked about. They can give you really valuable insights into the overall health of your project and help you spot those subtle shifts that might indicate an emerging issue.
Okay, so let's say we've identified a potential problem. What are some of the common types or categories of project issues that we might typically encounter?
Well, project issues can really run the gamut.
Yeah.
They can be technical in nature, like software bugs or system failures, or they can be related to resources, like a shortage of skilled personnel or a lack of essential materials. Scope creep, as we mentioned earlier, is a very common issue. When those project requirements keep expanding beyond the original agreement, it can really throw things off track.
And those little additions can add up quickly, can't they?
They absolutely can. And then there are stakeholder-related issues,
Yeah.
disagreements between stakeholders, unmet expectations, or just a general lack of engagement.
Right, those human factors can be some of the trickiest to navigate.
They really can. And finally, you might encounter issues related to compliance and regulatory requirements,
Yeah.
making sure that you're meeting all the necessary standards and regulations.
Okay, so once we've identified an issue, why is it so important to document it properly?
Well, a well-maintained issue log is really your best friend when it comes to managing project issues. It serves as a single source of truth about what problems have occurred, how they're impacting the project, and how you're addressing them.
So it's not just about keeping track of the problems, it's about having a clear record of how you're resolving them.
Exactly. It ensures transparency and accountability both within the team and with your stakeholders.
Okay, so what are the essential elements that we need to include when we're documenting an issue in our issue log?
Well, first of all, you want to give each issue a unique identifier, something like IS001, IS002, so you can easily track and reference them.
Okay, that makes sense. What else?
You need a clear and concise description of the issue itself. What's the problem in a nutshell?
Okay.
And then you want to record the date. The issue was identified, the impact assessment,
Right.
How is this issue currently affecting or potentially going to affect the project?
Right. How big of a deal is this?
Exactly. And you want to assign an owner, who's the person or the team responsible for resolving this issue.
Okay.
And then you'll want to assign a priority level. Is this a critical issue, a high priority, a medium priority?
So we know what to focus on first.
Exactly. And finally, you'll want to track the resolution status. Is the issue in progress? Is it resolved? Is it pending?
So everyone knows where things stand.
Precisely. So to give you a real-world example, imagine you have an issue where a key technical resource, John Doe, has unexpectedly gone on medical leave for a couple of weeks.
Oh, it's not good.
No, it's not. So you would log this issue with a description like key technical resource, unavailable impact assessment, potential delay of feature X development by 5 to 7 business days, owner, the engineering manager, priority level, high resolution status, assessing resource options.
So pretty straightforward, but all the essential information is there.
Exactly. And then the key is to use this issue log actively. Review it regularly in your team meetings, make sure the assigned owners are working on resolving those issues, use project management software to track progress, and have a clear escalation process in place if an issue isn't being addressed in a timely manner.
So it's a living document, not just something that sits on a shelf.
Exactly. So the main takeaway here is that mastering the process of identifying those various types of project issues and documenting them thoroughly in a well-maintained issue log is really the foundation for effective issue management.
Absolutely. And here's another question for you to ponder. How consistently do you document project issues in your current projects? What improvements could you make to your process to ensure better clarity, accountability, and ultimately more effective resolution?
I think that's a really important question for all of us to consider.
Okay, so let's move on now to another critical aspect of issue management, evaluating the impact of those issues we've identified.
Right, because not all issues are created equal.
Yeah.
Some are minor annoyances, while others can seriously threaten the success of your entire project.
So how do we determine just how big of a deal an issue really is?
Well, it starts with understanding the potential impact across different dimensions of your project. So first, consider the impact on scope. Will this issue affect the deliverables you're committed to providing? Will it require you to do more work than originally planned?
Right, so it's about understanding the potential for scope creep.
Exactly. Then you need to look at the schedule. Will this issue cause any delays to your milestones? How much time might it take to resolve? Does it affect any activities that are on your critical path?
Okay, so we're looking at scope and schedule. What else?
Well, cost is another big one. Will resolving this issue require any additional resources or budget adjustments? Do you have any contingency funds set aside that you might need to tap into?
Right, because those unexpected costs can really add up.
They absolutely can. And then there's the impact on quality. Could this issue compromise the quality of your final deliverables? Will you need to spend extra time and money on rework to correct any defects?
So it's not just about getting it done, it's about getting it done right.
Yeah. Exactly. And finally, and this is often overlooked, you need to consider the impact on your stakeholders and your team. How will this issue affect their morale, their productivity, their confidence in the project?
Right, because those human factors can be just as important as the technical ones.
Absolutely. So once you've carefully considered all of these factors, you can start to evaluate the overall severity of the issue.
And how do we go about doing that in a more structured way?
Well, one common approach is to use an issue impact matrix. This basically involves categorizing issues into different levels of impact. Low, medium, high, with clear descriptions of what each level means.
So it's like a rating system for your issues.
Exactly. For instance, a low-impact issue might have minimal effect on the project schedule and be relatively easy to resolve, whereas a high-impact issue could seriously threaten the project's success.
Okay, so that gives us a general sense of severity. But are there any other more detailed techniques we can use to really dig into the potential impact?
Absolutely. You can borrow some tools from risk assessment, for example, failure mode and effects analysis, or FMEA, can help you understand how an issue might escalate and what the potential consequences could be. Root cause analysis, or RCA, can help you identify the underlying cause of the issue, which is crucial for preventing it from happening again.
So it's about getting to the root of the problem.
Exactly. And cost-benefit analysis can help you weigh the financial implications of different resolution strategies.
Okay, so we've assessed the severity now. How do we decide which issues to prioritize?
Well, based on your impact assessment, you can categorize your issues as critical, high priority, medium priority, and low priority critical issues obviously demand immediate attention because they pose a direct threat to the project's success.
Right, those are the ones you need to tackle head on.
Exactly. High priority issues also need to be addressed quickly, but they might not be quite as urgent. Medium priority issues can be handled in a more timely manner, and low priority issues are generally minor and can be addressed when you have some breathing room.
Okay, and is there a visual tool that can help us with this prioritization process?
Yes, an issue priority matrix is a great way to visualize this. You plot your issues based on their urgency and their impact. So the issues that fall in that high urgency, high impact quadrant, those are your top priorities.
So it helps you to see at a glance where you need to focus your efforts.
Exactly. And for those critical issues, it's important to have a clear escalation process in place.
Right, so that everyone knows who to contact and what steps to take.
Exactly. It usually involves documenting the issue, notifying all the relevant stakeholders, proposing solutions, obtaining approvals, and then implementing the chosen course of action.
And how do we make sure our stakeholders are in the loop throughout this process?
Well, communication is key when you're talking to your stakeholders about issues. Use clear and concise language, explain the nature of the problem, the potential impact, and any proposed solutions.
Right, don't bury them in technical jargon.
No, absolutely not. And whenever possible, use data to support your points. Show them the numbers, show them the evidence, and be sure to keep them updated regularly on the progress of your resolution efforts.
So transparency is paramount.
Absolutely. So the key takeaway here is that learning how to systematically evaluate the impact of your project issues and prioritize them effectively is essential for staying on track and achieving your project goals.
And here's another food for thought question for you. Can you recall a project issue where the initial perceived impact turned out to be quite different from the actual impact once you dug a little deeper? What did you learn from that experience?
Sometimes those surprises can be real eye-openers.
Right, so we've identified the issue, we've assessed its impact. Now let's talk about developing a solid plan of action to address it.
Because having a clear roadmap is crucial for resolving issues efficiently and effectively.
So what are the essential steps involved in creating an action plan?
Well, first, you need to make sure you have a crystal clear definition of the issue itself.
Yeah.
Everyone needs to be on the same page about exactly what the problem is.
Right, no ambiguity.
Exactly. And then comes the really important part, identifying the root cause. Don't just treat the symptoms, dig down, and figure out why the issue happened in the first place.
And are there any specific techniques that can help with that root cause analysis?
Absolutely. Things like the 5 whys method or creating a fishbone diagram can be really helpful in this stage. It's about asking why, until you get to the heart of the matter.
Okay, so we've defined the issue.
Here.
We've identified the root cause. What's next?
Well, now it's time to brainstorm potential solutions, get your team together, get your stakeholders involved, and explore all the possible options.
Right, so it's a collaborative process.
Absolutely. And once you have a list of potential solutions, you need to evaluate each one carefully. How feasible is it to implement? What would be the cost? What's the likely impact on the issue and on the project as a whole?
So it's about weighing the pros and cons.
Exactly. And then you select the solution that you believe will be most effective.
Okay.
And once you've chosen your solution, you need to assign clear responsibilities and allocate the necessary resources. Make sure you have the right people on the job with the skills, the authority, and the tools they need to get it done.
Right, it's all about setting people up for success.
Absolutely. And you need to establish a clear timeline for implementation. When do you need to complete each step? What are the key milestones? And are there any dependencies between tasks?
So it's about creating a realistic schedule.
Exactly. And finally, you need to define measurable success criteria. How will you know if your action plan has actually been effective in resolving the issue?
Right, you need a way to track your progress.
Absolutely. And are there any specific tools or techniques that can help us with this action planning process?
Well, there are some great issue resolution frameworks out there like PDCA Plan, Do Check Act, and DMAEC, Define, Measure, Analyze, Improve, Control. These frameworks provide a structured approach to problem solving.
Those are tried and true methodologies.
They are. And of course, project management software can be incredibly helpful in tracking action items, managing deadlines and keeping everyone on the same page.
Right. It's all about leveraging technology to streamline the process.
Absolutely. And don't forget about those risk mitigation strategies we talked about earlier, those contingency plans. And that's scenario analysis can be really valuable in developing your action plan.
Right. It's about being prepared for the unexpected.
Exactly. And speaking of preparation, how can we effectively involve our stakeholders in this action planning process to make sure everyone is on board?
Stakeholder engagement is so crucial. Make sure you identify all the key stakeholders early on, communicate with them clearly about the issue, and the proposed solutions involve them in the decision-making process where appropriate.
Right. Because you want to build buy-in and support for the plan.
Absolutely, and be proactive in managing expectations and addressing any conflicts that might arise.
Okay, so once we have our action plan in place and we're starting to implement it, are we done or do we need to keep a close eye on things?
Oh, you definitely need to monitor the progress closely. Track those updates, analyze the data, see if the actions you're taking are actually having the desired effect.
So it's not a set it and forget it kind of thing.
No, definitely not. You need to be flexible and adapt your plan as needed if the issue persists or if new challenges emerge.
Right. It's about being agile and responsive.
Exactly. And don't forget to learn from the experience after the issue has been resolved. Take some time to reflect on what worked well, what could have been done better, and document those lessons learned for future reference.
So it's a continuous improvement loop.
Exactly. And when you do successfully resolve an issue, take a moment to celebrate that success, recognize the contributions of your team, and acknowledge the efforts that went into getting things back on track.
So the big takeaway here is that developing a comprehensive and well-structured action plan is essential for effectively addressing project issues. But it's an ongoing process that requires ongoing monitoring, adaptation, and of course, collaboration. And before we move on, here's another question for you to think about. Think about a time when an action plan you developed was either really successful or maybe not so successful. What do you think are the key factors that contributed to that outcome?
Sometimes it's helpful to analyze those past experiences to see what we can learn from them.
All right, let's move on to our final module for today, which is all about collaboration and working together with our stakeholders to resolve project issues.
Because at the end of the day, successful issue management is a team sport. It's not something you can do in isolation.
Right. It takes a village.
It really does. So when you're faced with an issue, it's crucial to identify all the key stakeholders who need to be involved in the resolution process.
And who are those stakeholders typically?
Well, they can come from both inside and outside your organization internally. You might have your project team members, other department heads, senior executives, project sponsors, and externally you might have your clients, your vendors, your suppliers, even regulatory bodies.
Right. So it's a pretty diverse group potentially.
It can be, and it's important to understand their individual roles, their influence on the project, and their level of interest in the specific issue at hand.
Okay. And once we've identified our stakeholders, how do we effectively communicate with them about the issue and our plans for addressing it?
Well, establishing those open and reliable communication channels is essential.
Yeah.
Make sure information can flow freely between all parties.
Right. No silos.
Exactly. And when you're communicating about the issue, be clear, be concise, and be direct. Use plain language, explain the nature of the problem, its potential impact, and any proposed solutions you're considering.
Right. Keep it simple.
Absolutely. And don't be afraid to use data to support your points. Show them the evidence from your issue log, from your risk assessments, from your performance metrics.
Right. Let the numbers speak for themselves.
Exactly. And visual aids can be really helpful too. Charts, graphs, dashboards, anything that can help them grasp the situation quickly and easily.
So painting a clear picture.
Exactly. And beyond just keeping stakeholders informed, it's important to involve them in the decision-making process as well.
Right. Give them a voice.
Exactly. You might want to organize meetings or workshops where you can brainstorm solutions together, gather diverse perspectives, and work towards a consensus.
So it's about leveraging the collective wisdom of the group.
Yeah, exactly. And once you've reached a decision, be sure to clearly assign roles and responsibilities so that everyone knows who's doing what and who's accountable for what.
Right. So there's no confusion or finger pointing.
Exactly. Now, what about those situations where there might be conflicting opinions or priorities among stakeholders? How do you navigate that tricky territory?
Yeah, those can be tough conversations.
They absolutely can, but the key is to address those conflicts head on. Don't try to sweep them under the rug. Identify the source of the conflict, use active listening techniques to understand each stakeholder's perspective, and then try to find a solution that addresses everyone's concerns as best as possible.
So it's about finding common ground.
Exactly. And throughout this whole process, it's crucial to maintain a professional and respectful approach. Even when things get heated, keep those relationships positive. And remember that the ultimate goal is to resolve the issue and achieve the project objectives.
Right, so don't let those personal differences derail the entire project.
Exactly. And finally, once you've reached a resolution, don't just assume everything is fine and dandy. You need to continue monitoring the situation, track the progress, keep your stakeholders informed, and be prepared to adapt your plan as needed.
So it's about staying engaged and being flexible.
Exactly. So the key takeaway here is that collaboration with stakeholders is absolutely essential for effective issue management. When you work together openly and proactively, you can overcome even the most challenging obstacles.
Absolutely. And here's one final question for you to reflect on. Can you think of a specific situation where effective stakeholder collaboration played a key role in resolving a tough project issue? What made that collaboration so successful?
It's always inspiring to hear those success stories and learn from each other's experiences.
All right, well, we've covered a lot of ground today. We've explored the difference between risks and issues, how to identify and document problems, how to evaluate their impact, how to develop action plans, and how to collaborate effectively with our stakeholders.
It's been a comprehensive deep dive into the world of issue management.
It really has, and we hope that you, our listener, have gained some valuable insights and practical tools that you can apply to your own projects.
Absolutely remember that mastering these concepts can make a huge difference in your ability to navigate those inevitable challenges that arise in project work.
And here's a final thought to leave you with. Think about how you can proactively incorporate the lessons you've learned from past issues into your current project planning processes. How can you use those experiences to anticipate potential problems and develop strategies to avoid them?
That's a really powerful idea, turning those challenges into opportunities for improvement.
Absolutely. And just a reminder, this practical guidance is brought to you by Burgeon Palms at www.burgeonpalms.org as part of the Practical Project Management Training. Thanks so much for joining us today.
It's been a pleasure.
We'll see you next time.
Until then.
Bye.